Welcome to the historic blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Starting with Story 1, The Birth of the Gods, Sumerian Cosmogony and Divine Hierarchies. In the beginning, before bricks formed cities, and before scribes etched law onto clay, there was only the deep. You might picture silence, but the ancient Sumerians imagined something a little different. For them, the universe began not with a bang or even a whisper, but with Namu, the primordial sea. She was not simply a place but a being shapeless yet generative, carrying within her the chaotic waters from which everything would be born. It was Namu who gave rise to the heavens and the earth, and in doing so, she began the long chain of divine genealogy that would eventually govern the lives of shepherds, kings, and barley farmers alike. This was not mythology in the way we often think of it. For the Sumerians, these stories were structure. They were explanations for weather, for disease, for a child's sudden fever, or a harvest's failure. The gods were not far-off abstractions. They lived in every bend of the river, in every grain silo, and on every brick of the ziggurat. As you begin to settle into this ancient rhythm, you might picture yourself beside a mud brick wall, somewhere near Eridu, the city many considered the world's first. The Tigris and Euphrates murmur in the distance. A priest murmurs louder, reciting a hymn to Enki, god of water and wisdom, Namu's gifted son. The first divine order. Namu birthed in heaven and Kai earth, the sky above and the soil beneath. In time, Enki united to produce Enlil, the wind. It was Enlil who separated his parents, pushing the sky away from the earth so that life could exist between them. This act of separation is one of the earliest moments of cosmic agency in Sumerian cosmogony. It defined the start of structure, the creation of the visible world. What came after was a kind of divine bureaucracy, a complex pantheon of deities, each with a portfolio of duties. Just like a well-governed city, the gods had domains and responsibilities, alliances and rivalries. And Anu, supreme god of the heavens, distant and often uninvolved. Enlil, god of air and storms, he wielded authority over kingship and decrees. Enki, lord of the freshwater and intelligence, a deity of cunning and creation. Inanna Ishtar, goddess of love, war, and political power. Udu Shamus, the sun god, judge of truth and justice. Ninhursag, the great mother, goddess of fertility and the mountains. Each of these gods had temples, rituals, and priesthoods, but in these early myths, they were still becoming, still being defined by the stories people told. Religion without scriptures. Unlike later religions with codified texts, the early Sumerians had no holy book. Their cosmology was maintained through oral traditions, hymns, and myths written in cuneiform on clay tablets. These were often kept in temple archives, accessible only to the scribes and priests who could read and write the complex symbols. What's fascinating is how bureaucratic this divine world quickly became. The gods had roles, even assistants. Some deities were only ever messengers. Others managed canals or looked after cattle. This granular theology reflected how Sumerian society functioned, hierarchically, with every person and god having a job to do. It's important to remember that religion wasn't a separate category in early Mesopotamia. There was no word for religion, as we understand it. The gods were woven into every institution, from politics to trade, from farming to law. Divine templates, gods as models for kingship. The gods didn't just live in temples, they lived in the kings. Early rulers often claimed divine endorsement or even semi-divine ancestry. Lugal-Tsetse, Ur-Nammu, and Gilgamesh all invoked the gods in their legitimacy. In the city-state model that dominated Sumer, each urban center had a patron deity. Uruk had Inanna, Nippur had Enlil, Eridu had Enki, Ur had Nanna, the moon god. This meant wars weren't just about cities, they were about the gods of those cities. When one city conquered another, their gods were often absorbed or subordinated in myths and rituals. In some cases, statues of gods were kidnapped during conquests, a symbolic way to show control over a divine domain. The temple as cosmic center. Imagine standing in the Ina precinct of Uruk. Massive mud brick platforms rise before you, stacked like stairways to the sky. Priests, dressed in linen, chant as incense drifts upward. This is not a place of worship in the modern sense, it is a cosmic control center. Temples were the homes of the gods, but they were also administrative complexes handling the storage of grain, the management of labor, the writing of contracts. A temple was a god's residence, yes, but also a city hall, a granary, and a university. Priests didn't only perform rituals. They managed land, collected taxes, often paid in grain, and enforced contracts. Some temples employed hundreds of people, from weavers to brewers. The wealth they accumulated wasn't just for the gods, it was for the functioning of society. Sacred routine. Religion as daily logistics. For most Mesopotamians, religion wasn't a matter of belief, it was a matter of routine. Sacrifices had to be made regularly. Omens had to be read. If a bad dream came in the night, it wasn't ignored. A priest had to interpret it. If a child was born with a malformed limb, it meant a message from the gods, sometimes ominous, sometimes instructive. Even building projects began with religious rituals. Foundation stones were buried with dedicatory inscriptions, and often with offerings to ensure divine favor. Farming was deeply tied to religious calendars. The flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates was unpredictable, so offerings were made to gods like Ninurta, hoping he would grant fertile silt rather than devastating deluge. The unseen threads. In all of this, the myths, the rituals, the temples, what stands out most is the way religion was not optional. It was not chosen, not discussed in terms of personal faith. It was assumed, embedded in the very idea of existence. To be alive was to be subject to the gods, just as a citizen was subject to the king. And in this early world, with its harsh climate and volatile politics, the gods were a source of both comfort and terror. They could bless a harvest, or they could send famine. They could help you win a war, or they could whisper betrayal into a general's ear. So we return to Nammu, the sea that bore the gods. In this ancient vision, she still flows underneath everything. Even the later gods owe her their existence. But why did she disappear from later myths? Why did the matriarch fade from memory, replaced by kings and male deities? What does it mean when the origin is forgotten? By now, you understand that early Mesopotamian religion wasn't something confined to ritual or faith, it was the scaffolding of civilization itself. From the vast temples of Uruk to the humble altar in a farmer's courtyard, the presence of the divine was everywhere. In this second section, we move from the shapeless origins of the gods to the physical structures, bureaucracies, and social systems that religion created as it became deeply embedded in daily life. The birth of the temple state. As the Sumerians transitioned from nomadic or semi-nomadic societies to permanent urban centers, the temple evolved from a ritual site to a governing institution. These temples, often dedicated to a city's patron deity, began to own land, manage agricultural production, and organize labor. In a world without coinage, wealth was measured in grain, livestock, textiles, and labor, and temples became the primary managers of these resources. Offerings to the gods weren't just symbolic. A family's tithe, often 1/10 of its produce, was expected to support the god's household, which in turn was the city's nerve center. By 3000 BCE, major temples employed hundreds, sometimes thousands of workers. Many of these were dependents of the temple, orphans, widows, and war captives who had no land of their own and lived by working temple fields or craft shops. Priests, meanwhile, weren't just spiritual leaders, they were administrators, scribes, and accountants. Temples as divine corporations. The great temple of Enlil in Nippur, for example, functioned much like a modern corporation. It had its own records department, warehouse systems, and even seals for authorization. Tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets have been discovered recording the temple's transactions, inventories, and employee roles. These records show a society in which divine and economic authority were intertwined. A priest oversaw the temple's grain storage and distribution. Another priest specialized in the inspection and breeding of livestock. Teams of laborers, categorized by rank and gender, harvested crops and built irrigation canals. Temple scribes kept exhaustive records, tracking each delivery of barley, every bolt of wool, and even the weight of fish caught in temple-controlled waterways. The gods, it seemed, needed a fully functioning civil service to keep their earthly homes in order. Priestly classes and the sacred bureaucracy. Over time, the religious class became highly stratified. Not all priests were created equal. The high priest N, often closely tied to kingship, this figure may have had both political and religious authority, especially in cities like and Uruk. Enheduanna, whom we will explore in a later story, held this prestigious title. Diviners and exorcists, Baru and Ashipu. These specialists interpreted omens, diagnosed spiritual ailments, and performed purification rituals. Their role was vital in times of plague or celestial misfortune. Lamentation priests, called upon during funerals, eclipses, and citywide crises, they composed and performed sacred dirges to appease angry gods. Temple scribes, Dubsar, tasked with documenting temple activities, scribe priests held immense power through their mastery of writing. Their tablets shaped law, theology, and economy alike. There were also female clergy, many of whom served as temple singers, weavers, or priestesses tied to fertility and love deities like Inanna. Some even oversaw temple estates, offering an early form of administrative authority for women in religious life. The ziggurat, sacred engineering. As temples grew in complexity, so too did their architecture. The most iconic religious structures of Mesopotamia, the ziggurats, emerged during the early dynastic and Akkadian periods. Ziggurats weren't places for congregational worship. Ordinary people did not enter these towering structures. Instead, they were stairways between heaven and earth, believed to be the god's actual dwelling place. The top platform housed a shrine where only select priests could enter and where divine presence could manifest. Each ziggurat was associated with a patron deity. The Edemenenki, temple of the foundation of heaven and earth, in Babylon was dedicated to Marduk. The ziggurat of one of the best preserved, was dedicated to Nana, the moon god. Building a ziggurat was both a political and religious act. Kings who constructed or restored ziggurats often inscribed their names on foundation stones, ensuring their legacy was intertwined with divine favor. The higher the structure, the more likely it was to be seen as a bridge between human labor and divine will. The god-king relationship. By the late 3rd millennium BCE, kingship and divinity had become inseparable. Rulers no longer merely claimed divine support, they claimed divine identity. This began notably with Naram-Sin of Akkad, who declared himself a living god and had temples erected in his name. This act wasn't received universally. It shocked many priesthoods and challenged the older idea that kings were servants of the gods, not their peers. But it illustrates a growing tension in Mesopotamian theology. If humans could become gods, what did that mean for the cosmic order? Despite this, most kings were still viewed as chosen by the gods, confirmed by omens and rituals, and crowned only with the approval of temple authorities. The king's most sacred duty was to uphold Mat, a later Egyptian term, but similar in concept to the Mesopotamian idea of Me, or Namtar, the divine decrees or destinies that govern the world. A king who failed in this duty could be blamed for plagues, floods, or crop failures. In such cases, rituals of substitution were performed. Sometimes a mock king, a scapegoat, was crowned temporarily, absorbing divine wrath before being exiled or killed. When the gods were silent, even with this elaborate structure, there were times when the gods appeared absent. Droughts, invasions, or disease were interpreted as signs of divine displeasure, but priests didn't always know why. The omens might be vague, the dreams unclear. In such moments, the response wasn't to doubt the gods, but to perform more rituals, offer more sacrifices, commission more hymns. At times, entire cities were abandoned, their temples left in ruins. Yet even then, care was taken to bury the divine statues, to leave inscriptions hoping future generations would restore the gods' home. In this way, Mesopotamian religion was a long memory, a thread running through centuries of ruin and rebuilding. The rise of theological debate. By the Old Babylonian period, scribes began copying and preserving theological texts. Some of these were overtly mythological, such as the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic. Others were more philosophical, pondering fate, suffering, and divine justice. The Dialogue of Pessimism, for example, is a strange and subtle text that reads almost like satire. It suggests that no matter what one does, marry, eat, fight, or pray, there is no guarantee of success. The gods will remain unknowable. This emerging sense of uncertainty didn't undo religious devotion. It refined it, adding layers of humility and skepticism. Even in temples, people began to realize that not every prayer would be answered, not every ritual would avert disaster. But still, they continued, because the structure was too deeply ingrained. The gods were not optional, they were infrastructure. A civilization woven in faith. By the end of this second section, we can begin to understand the durability of Mesopotamian religion. It wasn't a fad or a set of beliefs, it was the operating system of the entire region for over 2 millennia. Cities rose and fell, empires collapsed and re-emerged, but the temples, the priests, the rituals, they remained, modified, sometimes renamed, sometimes merged with other traditions, but always present. And yet, one might ask, with all this power and all this structure, what happened when the people began to question it? What happens when gods lose wars, or when foreign conquerors bring their own deities? We've followed the Sumerian gods from their birth in the cosmic sea to their elevation atop the ziggurats and into the bureaucratic machinery of temple life. But civilizations do not remain static, and neither do their deities. In this final section, we explore what happened when the divine order faltered. When cities fell, foreign powers arrived, and the sacred foundations of Mesopotamia were tested by history, politics, and time itself. The fall of Sumer and the fragility of divine favor. It's tempting to see the ancient gods of Mesopotamia as permanent fixtures, timeless figures reigning from above brick and bitumen temples. But the truth is more fragile. The collapse of the Sumerian city-states around 2000 BCE was not just political or economic, it was cosmic. In the Mesopotamian worldview, a city's conquest wasn't due to weak walls or poor planning. It meant the gods had abandoned their people, or worse, had been defeated themselves. When fell to the Elamites, the priesthood composed long laments describing not just the city's destruction, but the departure of the gods. In these texts, the statues of deities are said to weep, their temples abandoned, their rituals silenced. For a society that had woven divinity into every layer of life, this was a spiritual crisis. But interestingly, this didn't lead to widespread rejection of the gods. Instead, it led to reinterpretation, merging, and a new layer of theological adaptation. The Akkadian inheritance, fusion and translation. With the rise of Semitic-speaking Akkadians first as outsiders, then as rulers under Sargon of Akkad, Mesopotamian religion underwent its first great translation. The Sumerian pantheon didn't disappear. Instead, the Akkadians adopted and syncretized it, blending deities, renaming them in Semitic form and modifying their functions. Enki became E. Inanna became Ishtar. Udu became Shamas. Nana became Sin. This wasn't cultural theft, it was cultural layering. Temples continued to function, but now their inscriptions appeared in both Sumerian and Akkadian. Bilingualism in worship became common. Akkadian kings like Sargon and Naram-Sin embraced the old gods, while also introducing new imperial ideologies linking their divine right to rule not just to Enlil or Ishtar, but to their own elevated status as agents or embodiments of divine power. Thus the gods didn't fade, they adapted, evolving through empires. Babylon, the rise of Marduk. Nowhere is this divine evolution more evident than in Babylon. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, Babylon was a minor city-state. Its rise to prominence brought with it the elevation of Marduk, a previously obscure local deity. Through the Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish Marduk was transformed from a city god into the king of the gods, defeating the primordial sea goddess Tiamat and organizing the cosmos. In this myth, older gods like Anu, Enlil, and E willingly cede power to Marduk, recognizing his supremacy. It's a brilliant piece of political theology, justifying Babylon's imperial rule by recasting its god as the architect of order. The Enuma Elish was recited annually during the Akitu festival, where the king ritually reenacted creation and reaffirmed Marduk's rule, and by extension, his own. Through Marduk, Babylonian rulers asserted continuity with ancient Sumerian tradition, while also rewriting the cosmic hierarchy to fit their world. Personal religion and everyday piety. While grand theological shifts played out in ziggurats and royal inscriptions, the religious lives of ordinary people continued in more intimate forms. Clay figurines, amulets, and incantation bowls found in homes reveal a vibrant world of personal devotion. People prayed to household gods, protective spirits, and ancestors. They recited incantations to protect newborns, to ward off illness, or to undo curses. People sought help not only from major gods like Ishtar or Shamas, but from minor deities, demons, and even anonymous spirits. The lines between divine and dangerous were often blurred. A being like Lamishtu could afflict infants, while another like Pazuzu could be invoked to fight her. There was no concept of salvation in the Mesopotamian sense. The goal wasn't moral purity, but balance, avoiding divine wrath, securing divine favor, and surviving the unpredictable forces of life. Death in the underworld. For the Mesopotamians, the afterlife was not a place of reward or punishment. It was a continuation, but one defined by shadows and silence. According to texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh and Descent of Inanna, the dead resided in the netherworld, a dark, dusty realm beneath the earth ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal. Here, souls lived as shades, eating dust and drinking muddy water. There was no redemption, no resurrection. The best one could hope for was to be remembered, to have descendants pour libations, offer bread, and speak your name. A forgotten soul was a suffering soul. This somber view of death explains why funerary rites were so vital. Failing to bury someone properly was not just a social failing, it risked condemning their spirit to unrest, or worse, turning them into a vengeful ghost. religious continuity under foreign rule. Despite numerous conquests by the Kassites, Assyrians, Persians, the core of Mesopotamian religious structure endured. Each ruling power absorbed or tolerated local deities. The Assyrians promoted Ashur, their national god, but continued to revere Ishtar, Shamash, and Marduk. Temples remained active. Omens were still read. Festivals were still observed. Even Cyrus the Great, the Persian king who conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, portrayed himself as a liberator sent by Marduk. His inscriptions adopt the language of Mesopotamian kingship, showing how deeply entrenched the religious model had become even for outsiders. But underneath this continuity, changes were brewing. As the Achaemenid Empire established control, Zoroastrian influence began to seep in. Later, Hellenistic rulers brought in Greek culture and religion. The gods of old Mesopotamia began to fade not violently, but gradually, like incense smoke in a temple long abandoned. The last echoes of the gods. By the 1st century CE, the last cuneiform tablets were being inscribed by a dwindling number of scribes in places like Uruk and Sippar. These texts, written in Sumerian or Akkadian, were no longer read by the common people. The gods, too, had become literary figures' memories of a once vivid cosmos. Ziggurats crumbled, temples turned to rubble, statues were looted or buried, yet the stories lingered. The Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, survived not just on tablets, but in fragments of influence. Echoes of the flood story in Genesis, of the Tower of Babel, of divine kingship and cosmic rebellion, all trace lines back to Mesopotamia. Even the concept of divine law, as seen in Hammurabi's code, shaped later religious and legal traditions. A reflection, the gods beneath our feet. So what do we make of a civilization whose gods once ruled every corner of life, yet who now lie silent beneath museum glass and archaeological dust? There is a lesson in Mesopotamian religion not just about belief, but about human order. The gods were tools majestic and feared, yes, but also models. They showed people how to structure society, how to manage resources, how to survive. They justified rule, demanded justice, and offered consolation when none could be found. In the end, Mesopotamian religion was less about salvation than about continuity, keeping the fields irrigated, the calendar steady, the ancestors remembered. It was, in every sense, the architecture of civilization. And perhaps that's the most haunting thing, that even gods in time can become relics of order lost in translation, remembered only in the rhythm of stories. So, as you settle further into sleep, and the waters of Namu flow quietly in your mind, ask yourself, when a god is forgotten, do they truly disappear or do they remain, waiting to be found again in the dust? Story 2. Enheduanna and the Rise of Temple Authority in Ur. The city of Ur, sometime around 2300 BCE. The river murmurs, and the white sun of the southern plain reflects off the courtyard of the grand temple of Nana, the moon god. Scribes sharpen their styluses. Incense curls through the morning air, and in the heart of this sacred complex, a woman named Enheduanna takes her place. She is not just a priestess. She is a princess, the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, conqueror of Sumer, founder of the first known empire in human history. But she is something else as well, something even rarer. She is a writer. The first in history whose name we know. A world of gods and kings. Before we can understand Enheduanna's importance, we must return briefly to the world into which she was born. Sargon of Akkad, her father, had united the fractious Sumerian city-states under one banner, a revolutionary idea at the time. His empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, and with it came a need for new forms of control. Force alone could not govern such a vast, diverse realm. So Sargon turned to something older and more deeply rooted: religion. In a world where every city had its patron deity, Temples were not just religious sites, they were power centers. Their priests and priestesses wielded influence over land, labor, law, and even international diplomacy. By placing loyal figures in these sacred posts, Sargon could extend imperial legitimacy through spiritual authority. And so he appointed his daughter Enheduanna as high priestess of the moon god Nana in one of the most sacred roles in all of Mesopotamia. The letter 12097, High Priestess of the Moon. The title was not ceremonial. It was a religious office of immense administrative responsibility. As of Nana, Enheduanna oversaw temple operations, managing land, workers, and offerings, ritual calendars, ensuring proper sacrifices and festivals occurred, political diplomacy, acting as a religious ambassador between temple and crown, divine intercession, composing prayers and hymns to maintain favor from the gods. She likely lived within the temple precinct, surrounded by priests, acolytes, scribes, and servants. She had access to education, scribal resources, and the intellectual traditions of both Sumer and Akkad. Her appointment to this role was both a political act and a spiritual gesture, a fusion of the old Sumerian world and the new Akkadian order. And it is within this context that Enheduanna began to write. The first named author in history. Before Enheduanna, many anonymous scribes had recorded myths, hymns, legal codes, and economic transactions, but none had claimed their work with a personal identity. Enheduanna changed that. In her most famous composition, The Exaltation of Inanna, in Nin Sa-gur-Ra, she opens with these lines: I, Enheduanna, the high priestess of Nana, I who entered the holy innermost, I have borne the ritual basket, I have uttered the joyous chant. This is not just prayer, this is personal authorship, a named woman describing her experience, her devotion, and her suffering. Enheduanna's writings are poetic, theological, and intensely emotional. She composed at least 42 temple hymns, dedicated to the gods of various Sumerian cities. These texts are not merely praise, they are tools of religious centralization, weaving diverse deities into a unified imperial theology. In other words, she used poetry to stabilize an empire. The crisis of authority. At some point during her tenure, Enheduanna faced political upheaval. A local uprising, possibly led by a rebel named Lugalain, forced her into exile. In The Exaltation of Inanna, she writes of being cast out, her rituals interrupted, her sacred duties stripped away. He has turned the temple into a battlefield. He has expelled me from the sanctuary. My life is consumed. O Inanna, bring your foot down upon his neck. This is no distant mythic tale. It is personal and political lament, expressed through sacred verse. Enheduanna invokes Inanna, the powerful goddess of love and war, to intervene and restore her. Eventually, she was reinstated. Her position, her voice, and her power returned. But what's striking is not only the restoration, it is that we remember her voice at all. In a world where kings carved their deeds into stone, Enheduanna carved her prayers into eternity through clay and metaphor. The role of women in temple life. Enheduanna's story opens a rare window into the religious and intellectual lives of women in ancient Mesopotamia. While male priests held many senior roles, priestesses were vital to the temple economy and cultic function. Some served as singers, others as ritual attendants. In major cities, Nadatu women, a class of celibate priestesses, controlled property, engaged in business, and lived in convent-like enclosures. But Enheduanna was exceptional even among these. She bridged two cultures, two languages, and two worlds, the sacred and the imperial. Through her writing, she deified Inanna, not just as a local deity, but as a cosmic force, a goddess of both creative and destructive power, able to elevate kings or crush them. a shifting religious landscape. Enheduanna lived during a transitional period. The Sumerian city gods still held sway, but the Akkadian Empire was reshaping their relationships. Temples were being woven into a larger political and cultural framework. Language, too, was shifting from Sumerian to Akkadian. Enheduanna's writings reflect this blend. Though composed in Sumerian, they bear Akkadian rhythms and imagery. They are cosmopolitan, yet rooted in local devotion. Her hymns to individual temples serve both as spiritual praise and imperial propaganda, asserting divine unity across diverse regions. Her work helped forge a religious identity that could span an empire. The weight of legacy. Enheduanna's name would survive for centuries in temple lists and scribal curricula. Her works were copied long after her death, studied by generations of scribes. For Mesopotamians, the act of copying a sacred text was a form of devotion. Her words became ritual speech, her poems liturgical canon. Later priestesses may have adopted her as a model. Later kings may have cited her hymns to legitimize their rule. And yet, after thousands of years, her story was forgotten until archaeologists in the 20th century uncovered her seal, bearing her name and title, and clay tablets that matched her hymns. In that moment, the ancient world whispered again. And for the first time in recorded history, a woman's voice rose from the past, not in myth or in name alone, but in her own words. Closing thoughts. As the moon sets over the ruins of and the shadows of empire stretch long over temple stones, we are left to wonder. What did it mean to be a woman of faith, power, and poetry in a time of conquest? Was Enheduanna shaping her world or merely surviving it, word by sacred word? As the day fades over the ziggurat of and the flickering oil lamps begin to burn in the quiet recesses of the temple complex, the high priestess enters the sacred chamber. The courtyard outside murmurs with chants. Incense coils into the rafters. At the heart of the temple, beside the altar of the moon god Nana, Enheduanna lifts her eyes not just in prayer but in poetry. We go deeper into her ritual role, the literary genius of her hymns, and how she used religious text as a tool of resistance, authority, and cultural engineering. Ritual power in the sacred precinct. Enheduanna's position as in-priestess of Nana placed her at the center of Sumerian religious life. The moon god's temple, the Igishurgal, House of Great Light, was one of the most powerful and wealthiest temple institutions in the entire region. Rituals at the temple would have been elaborate, following strict calendars based on lunar cycles. Enheduanna would have presided over new moon ceremonies, symbolizing renewal and divine presence. Offerings of grain, beer, and livestock, given daily to Nana's statue. Purification, rites to cleanse the temple and its personnel. Intercession rituals, asking the god for mercy, fertility, and protection. But Enheduanna's duties were not limited to ritual practice. She was a theologian, a political strategist, and a public figure, and her writings reflect the weight of those responsibilities. The temple hymns, mapping the divine order. One of Enheduanna's greatest contributions was her authorship of the temple hymns, a collection of 42 hymns, each dedicated to the temples and deities of different Mesopotamian cities. These hymns were not mere praises. They acted as spiritual atlases, mapping out a unified landscape of belief. In writing them, Enheduanna wasn't just worshiping the gods, she was weaving together the religious geography of Sumer and Akkad. Each hymn begins with a formal invocation of the temple's name, followed by descriptions of its divine function and its mythological relevance. For example, House of Zabalam, suited for rites. Joy of Inanna, radiant dwelling. House of Sacred Me, storing the divine decrees. The word me here refers to the divine ordinances or blueprints that governed cosmic and social order. Each temple, through its god, was a repository of cosmic functions. Enheduanna's hymns serve to standardize and reinforce this view, making the empire's spiritual landscape feel coherent and unified. In doing so, she helped transform a loose confederation of city-states into a spiritual federation under the broad umbrella of Sargon's empire. The Exaltation of Inanna, a personal and political hymn. While the temple hymns reflect institutional devotion, it is her poem, In Nin Sa-gur-ra, the Exaltation of Inanna, that offers her most powerful voice. The poem can be read on multiple levels. Theological, it raises Inanna to a place of unmatched supremacy, describing her as the force behind storms, battle, justice, and love. Personal, it recounts Enheduanna's exile, disgrace, and emotional torment at the hands of a rebel ruler, and her appeal to Inanna for deliverance. Political, it is a strategic attempt to reassert her authority, calling upon divine justice to restore the right order, both sacred and imperial. She writes, "They approached me in my chambers. They tore the sacred crown from my head. From the pure table they led me. I wandered among the thorny rocks of the wilderness." Here, the political exile is expressed in deeply mythic terms, aligning her suffering with the chaos that precedes restoration in Mesopotamian myth. By portraying herself as a ritual victim, she becomes a vessel for collective trauma and divine renewal. This use of personal suffering to express cosmic disorder is uniquely powerful. It's more than complaint, it's liturgy, using the rhythm of lament to align her fate with that of the goddess. Inanna as the archetype of power and transition. In raising Inanna above all other gods, Enheduanna is not just paying tribute, she's redefining divine hierarchy. Inanna becomes the goddess of inversion, the one who descends into the underworld and returns, who grants kingship and rescinds it, who weaves love and destruction together. This depiction of Inanna reflects Enheduanna's own complex role. A woman in a position of extraordinary power, in a male-dominated priesthood. A representative of empire, and yet a victim of local rebellion. A poet of order who experienced exile and chaos. Through Inanna, Enheduanna found a symbol that could contain contradictions, just as she did. And through poetry, she turned her biography into theology. Literature as political recovery. In the ancient world, exile often meant erasure. Removed from office, stripped of robes, and cast from sacred spaces, an official might simply vanish from history. But Enheduanna refused that fate. She reclaimed her voice, not with armies or decrees, but through language. The exaltation of Inanna is, in many ways, a reinstallation ceremony in verse. By praising the goddess so fervently, and positioning herself as Inanna's chosen vessel, she leverages divine legitimacy to regain her human authority. This blending of personal narrative, divine power, and imperial politics is a literary strategy far ahead of its time. And it worked. She was restored to her position. Her return was more than personal redemption. It was the return of cosmic order narrated and ritualized in verse. The afterlife of her words. Long after Enheduanna's death, her poems were preserved by temple scribes, copied in schools, and passed down through dynasties. In the scribal curriculum of the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE, students copied her hymns as part of their training. This ensured not only her survival but her canonization. She became a fixture of elite education, her voice echoing through classrooms and temples centuries after her exile and return. Her authorship was preserved by Colophon's lines at the end of clay tablets that recorded her name. This was rare in an era where authorship was typically anonymous, and even kings were hesitant to claim poetic creation. Because of this, Enheduanna is remembered not just as a priestess or political figure, but as the first known author in history whose name, personality, and artistic choices still resonate. A high priestess in a shifting world. Enheduanna lived at the crossroads of many transitions: the shift from Sumerian to Akkadian cultural dominance, the evolution of city-state religion into imperial theology, the emergence of written literature as a tool of statecraft and identity, the rare moment in history when a woman could shape ideology through both ritual and verse. Her story is not a footnote, it is a pivot point. She lived through rebellion and recovery, through shifts in language and liturgy. She crafted a narrative of power and piety that defined a generation and influenced many that followed. Closing thought. In the quiet dark of her exile, as she wandered among thorns, Enheduanna still composed verses. She still addressed the gods. She still wrote. It leads us to wonder. Is authorship an act of survival? When all else is taken from you, is the written word the only sanctuary the world cannot strip away? Now the moon rises again over the ancient city of The sacred precincts lie in silence, broken only by the rustle of reeds and the creak of wooden carts in the distance. The temple of Nana, once a center of faith, wealth, and power, now slumbers beneath centuries of dust. But something endures. In a clay tablet once discarded, now recovered lines of cuneiform whisper a name: Enheduanna. We have traced her ascent to power, her exile, her defiance through poetry, and her restoration. In this final section, we explore the aftermath, not just what happened to her, but how her ideas, language, and spiritual architecture endured, influenced others, and helped shape the very concept of divine authorship. After Enheduanna, the echo in the clay. After her death, sometime likely in the 23rd century BCE, Enheduanna's name did not fade, at least not immediately. Her works were copied by scribes for hundreds of years. Some were even used in scribal schools, particularly during the Old Babylonian period, c. 1900–1600 BCE, where young students learned the art of writing by inscribing sacred hymns, including hers. This ensured her survival not biologically, but textually. Archaeologists have discovered copies of her hymns in Nippur, and Sippar, indicating her reach was not merely local but interregional. Though scholars debate how many of the temple hymns were penned directly by her, the preservation of her name, title, and authorship suggests deep reverence. In Mesopotamian culture, to be remembered was to live eternally. And by that measure, Enheduanna succeeded beyond any royal decree or military conquest. Female voices in a male pantheon. Enheduanna's presence as a literary and spiritual figure was exceptional but not entirely isolated. Other women in Mesopotamia held religious titles: Natatu priestesses in Babylon and Sippar, sacred weavers and lamentation singers, even queen priestesses in Elam and Mari. Yet none claimed authorship the way she did. Through her poetry, she didn't just participate in theology, she shaped it. Her exaltation of Inanna redefined the goddess's role from a local deity of fertility and war into a universal force of divine authority and transformation. Later myths, such as Inanna's descent to the underworld, bear thematic resemblance to the imagery Enheduanna helped popularize: darkness, exile, rebirth, inversion of power. Whether she authored those later myths directly is uncertain, but the tone, the language, the spiritual complexity, these bear her fingerprints. Poetry as political infrastructure. We must remember, Enheduanna lived in the early days of empire. Her father, Sargon of Akkad, had built a new world, but he needed more than walls and soldiers to keep it intact. He needed loyal cities, unified belief systems, and divine justification. Enheduanna's temple hymns served this exact purpose. By crafting a theological network praising temples across Sumer and aligning their deities with imperial order, she subtly encouraged loyalty to a central power. The Akkadian crown wasn't just politically dominant, it was now spiritually sanctioned. In this way, her poetry was not abstract. It was logistical theology. It mapped out not just faith but compliance, and it did so in a voice rich with reverence, artistry, and precision. Later imitations and inspirations. As the Akkadian Empire gave way to the Ur-II dynasty, and then to the Old Babylonian period, the form and function of sacred writing evolved, but it did not forget Enheduanna. Later rulers like Gudea of Lagash composed temple hymns in similar formats praising gods, describing rituals, listing sacred architecture. These works often lack the personal voice that characterizes Enheduanna's writing, but the structure is clearly inspired by her model. Even Hammurabi, in his famous legal code, invokes the gods in a tone that echoes earlier compositions. While not poetry, his prologue presents him as a king chosen by Marduk, operating under divine order. The idea that rule is legitimized by divine favor, a hallmark of Enheduanna's theology, had become standard. Her voice, though no longer cited directly, had been absorbed into the language of power. The rediscovery, modern archaeology meets ancient verse. For millennia, Enheduanna's name was lost to history. Then, in the 1920s and 1930s, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated the royal tombs of Ur. Among the artifacts, he uncovered an alabaster disc bearing her name and title, Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon, priestess of Nana. Later, cuneiform tablets matching the language and content of the temple hymns and the exaltation of Inanna were found in Nippur and Ur. With these discoveries, modern scholars realized they were looking at the earliest named author in human history. Not a king, not a conqueror, but a priestess poet. A woman. Influence beyond Mesopotamia. It's difficult to trace direct literary influence from Enheduanna to later civilizations like Egypt, Greece, or Rome. But her role as the first recorded author and a female religious leader using poetic language to shape political theology resonates across time. Themes she explored: divine favor as the basis for political authority, the sacredness of speech and writing, the fusion of personal suffering with collective salvation, the spiritual ambiguity of goddesses as both nurturers and destroyers. These would become universal motifs, reappearing in later religious texts, royal propaganda, and devotional literature. And though no direct line connects Enheduanna to, say, the Psalms of David or the Lamentations of Sappho, the template she created, authoritative, personal, theological, political, would echo across millennia. Remembering her today. Enheduanna's story is now taught in literature, religious studies, women's history, and creative writing programs. Her hymns have been translated into modern languages. Her legacy lives not just in dusty museums, but in the idea that writing has power not just to document, but to transform. For modern readers, she offers many firsts. The first known author to sign her name. The first female religious writer with surviving works. One of the earliest poets of exile and restoration. A symbol of resilient voice in a patriarchal world. Her story challenges the notion that the ancient world lacked individuality. On the contrary, it teaches us that even in the 23rd century BCE, someone could write about power, trauma, injustice, and spiritual transcendence with a clarity that still resonates. Final reflection. So we close the tablet, place it back in the archive, and imagine Enheduanna not as a dusty artifact of empire, but as a living voice, composed of breath and ink and memory. She reminds us that authority is fragile but words endure, that the sacred and the political have always been intertwined, and that in the darkest hour, a single voice written in clay, rising in chant, remembered in dust, can carry across time. Even as Ur crumbles and empires fall, and names are lost, what survives is the word, and sometimes the one who dared to speak it. The Tigris and Euphrates flow slowly across the Mesopotamian plain, their waters heavy with silt. Beneath their shifting courses lies a world built not of stone or marble but of mud brick, baked under the desert sun and stacked with measured hands. These bricks, plain and perishable, would build cities, temples, and most strikingly, the ziggurat, Mesopotamia's architectural answer to the sacred mountain. To modern eyes, the ziggurat is often mistaken for a pyramid, but it is not a tomb, it is not a fortress, it is something far more elusive, a stairway for the gods, a bridge between heaven and earth, a stage for ritual, devotion, and cosmic alignment. This is the story of how such structures came to define Mesopotamian religious architecture, one brick at a time. The world without mountains. Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, was flat. Unlike neighboring regions, Egypt with its cliffs and deserts, Anatolia with its rugged hills, southern Mesopotamia offered no natural heights. The cities of Sumer and Akkad rose from wide floodplains where the horizon met the sky in a single uninterrupted line. In such a landscape, altitude itself became sacred. To rise above the earth was to approach the heavens. To build upward was to signify not just power but connection. But there was a problem. The land offered no stone. There were no granite quarries, no limestone hills. What the land had was mud, and so the Sumerians made do. Out of reeds, straw, and earth, they crafted mud bricks, simple, sun-dried blocks that could be mass-produced and laid in massive quantities. These bricks would become the foundation of their civilization, and ultimately, of their religion. From temple platform to ziggurat, the earliest religious structures in Mesopotamia, dating back to Ubaid and Uruk periods, c. 4000–3000 BCE, were built on raised platforms. These weren't ziggurats yet, but their purpose was similar: elevation of the sacred. Over time, these platforms grew more elaborate. Additional levels were added. Stairs became ramps. The topmost level came to house a shrine, known as the cella, the presumed dwelling place of the god. Thus emerged the classic form of the ziggurat, a stepped, terraced tower with multiple levels narrowing toward the top, built on a massive base, and often faced with glazed or baked brick to reflect sunlight in dazzling colors. Each major city had its own. Each was dedicated to the patron deity of that city. The ziggurat of Ur-Tinana, the moon god. The ziggurat of Babylon to Marduk, later known as Etemenenki. The ziggurat of Eridu to Enki, god of water and wisdom. The ziggurat of Nippur to Enlil, god of wind and command. Each structure wasn't merely religious. It was symbolic geography, a man-made mountain rising from the plains, recreating in brick what the gods once occupied in myth. Etemenenki and the meaning of names. Ziggurats were not just built, they were named, and their names reveal how they were perceived. The Great Ziggurat of Babylon, Etemenenki meant the foundation of heaven and earth. Ur-Ziggurat was Ijishurgao, the house of the great light. Nippur's ziggurat was Ikur, the mountain house. These were not metaphors. For the people who lived in their shadows, the ziggurats were mountains holy, deliberate, and inhabited by the divine. Each name reinforced the idea that these structures linked the realms, the heavens above, the mortal world below, and the mysterious underworld beneath. The climb and the ritual. The ziggurat was not a public space. Ordinary citizens did not ascend its ramps. Access was restricted, its rituals secretive, performed by high-ranking priests or kings acting in priestly roles. At the top, the shrine would house the statue of the deity, cared for daily through offerings of food, music, and incense. These rituals were not symbolic, they were seen as actual service to a living god. The gods ate, drank, bathed, and rested through the work of their servants. While we lack detailed accounts of daily rituals performed atop ziggurats, we know that major festivals, such as the Akitu, New Year, involved processions to and from the shrine, symbolic reenactments of divine journeys, and acts of sacred kingship. In some traditions, It was believed that the god would descend from heaven and temporarily reside in the shrine during certain times of the year, reaffirming the divine presence in the city. Engineering and labor. Building a ziggurat was not a simple task. It required tens of thousands of bricks, often handmade and stamped with the name of the king. A core of mud brick, layered with reed mats and bitumen for waterproofing. A facing of baked bricks, sometimes glazed in color blue, red, white. Drainage systems to protect the structure from rain damage. Complex ramps and stairways for access by priests. Ziggurat construction often spanned generations. Later kings would add levels, restore damaged portions, or reface older cores. In some cases, new rulers claimed to have rebuilt a ziggurat when in fact they merely refurbished what earlier dynasties had created. The labor was immense. While some workers were conscripted, others were likely specialists, masons, engineers, brickmakers, and artisans. Inscriptions often record the number of bricks laid, or boast of how many men were mobilized, turning construction into a spiritual act of statecraft. The king's divine role. For the kings who built or restored ziggurats, the rewards were twofold. Divine legitimacy. By aligning themselves with the gods, kings affirmed their right to rule. The ziggurat became physical proof of their piety and cosmic alignment. Historical immortality. Bricks were stamped with the king's name. In some cases, foundation deposits were left at the base, inscribed tablets, miniature tools, or votive figurines. These time capsules preserved the king's legacy for posterity. A typical inscription might read, I Namu, king of favored of Nana, built the temple tower with pure hands, for the joy of the god and the well-being of the people. In this way, construction itself became ritual, a labor not just of architecture, but of devotion. A living structure. Ziggurats were not static monuments. They were alive in a theological sense. They represented the heartbeat of the city's relationship with its god. To let a ziggurat crumble was more than architectural neglect. It signaled a breach in divine order. Invading armies often targeted temples not for loot alone, but to symbolically strip cities of their spiritual backbone. In response, new rulers would often restore or reconsecrate ziggurats, even foreign conquerors. The restoration was both a political message and a theological necessity. Ziggurats therefore became chronicles in brick layered with the fingerprints of successive dynasties, each asserting continuity through piety. But why the height? What exactly did the ziggurat's height achieve? Visibility. In a flat plain, it marked the city from miles away. Cosmic symbolism. Each level corresponded to celestial realms, possibly associated with the planets or heavens. Sacred distance. The climb set the shrine apart from the mundane world, making access a privilege. Flood resistance. In a land of sudden inundation, height was a form of spiritual safety. But more than any practical reason, the elevation symbolized longing to reach the gods, to touch the eternal, to remake the world in divine proportions. Closing thought. As we step back from the sunlit bricks, from the shimmering facade of the ziggurat of Ur or the ghostly outline of Etemenenki in Babylon, we must ask, were these towers built to bring gods down to earth, or to remind mortals how far they must rise to be heard? The ziggurat stands still, unmoving in the midday sun, but it was never idle. Beneath its steps and surrounding its base pulsed a complex religious machine, a temple economy, a political statement, a calendar of rites and offerings, all sustained by human hands. We descend into the working systems that sustain these towering structures and consider how they shaped the daily rhythm of ancient Mesopotamian life. The temple as ecosystem. The ziggurat was just the apex. Around it sprawled a temple complex, often several hectares in size. This compound included storage rooms for grain, oil, and offerings, residences for priests and temple workers, workshops for weavers, potters, and metalworkers, bakeries, breweries, and kitchens to prepare daily offerings, administrative offices where scribes tallied goods and managed labor. This ecosystem wasn't symbolic, it was economic. Temples like those in Uruk, and Nippur were among the largest landowners and employers in their cities. Every part of the ziggurats' function relied on this human infrastructure, feeding the god, maintaining ritual purity, hosting festivals, and fulfilling the sacred routines that upheld cosmic order. Feeding the gods. One of the key daily tasks performed by temple personnel was the preparation and presentation of meals to the god statue. This wasn't metaphorical. The statue of the deity housed in the shrine atop the ziggurat was considered alive. It had to be bathed, dressed, perfumed, and fed. Offerings included fresh-baked bread, roasted meats, beer and wine, fruit and honey, incense and oils. After the food was ritually offered, and presumably not eaten in any literal sense, it would be redistributed among the priests and temple staff, a sacred form of payroll. This process required meticulous timing, purification rituals, and carefully recorded inventories. Missing a step or offering improperly was thought to risk divine offense, and with it, famine, disease, or invasion. Rituals of time and space. Ziggurats were not just static shrines, they were active instruments of ritual timekeeping. Their placement and structure were often aligned with solar and lunar cycles, equinoxes and solstices, festival calendars tied to agricultural seasons. In Babylon, for example, the Akitu festival, New Year, featured elaborate rituals involving the ziggurat. The king was stripped of regalia and brought to the temple of Marduk. He would confess his failures and be ritually humiliated. The statue of Marduk was paraded from the ziggurat to a separate shrine. If the god accepted the king's penance, interpreted by priests, he was restored to power. This ritual wasn't symbolic, it was political renewal. The king's legitimacy was literally reaffirmed by the god through sacred performance staged on and around the ziggurat. Thus, the tower was not just a place, it was a timekeeper, a stage, and a gateway. Rebuilding as ritual duty. Ziggurats required constant maintenance. Made of mud brick, they were vulnerable to erosion, flood damage, and decay. Without regular refurbishment, a ziggurat could become dangerous within decades. Kings saw restoration as a sacred duty. Inscriptions often boast of their repairs as acts of piety. I found the temple of my God in ruin, its top broken, its bricks scattered. I, Shulgi the pious, rebuilt it in the image of heaven, with new cedar beams and gold-plated doors. Such acts weren't humble. They were political messages asserting divine favor, moral fitness, and historical continuity. Even when a king did not build a new ziggurat, he might restore the facade, enlarge the terrace, or decorate the shrine, each act marked by inscriptions and dated bricks, leaving a trail of devotion and ambition. Ziggurat colors and symbolism. While most ziggurats today are weathered and monochrome, archaeological evidence suggests many were once vividly colored. Glazed bricks in deep blues, reds, and yellows. Gold leaf accents on door frames and shrine ornaments. Possibly even polychrome murals or mosaics. Color had sacred meaning. Blue for the heavens, white for purity and moonlight, red for blood, power of the sun, black for the underworld. The climb to the shrine, therefore, was also a symbolic ascension through divine realms. Each level might represent a layer of the cosmos: earth, sky, stars, and heavens, culminating in the innermost holy space. The people who served. The temple complex was not a lonely sanctuary for priests. It was a city within a city, staffed by Sangha, the chief temple administrator; Guru, ceremonial priests; Nadatu, priestess women, often celibate and from noble families. Musicians and singers, vital for festival performances. Guards who protected temple treasures. Scribes who recorded every grain and garment. Many were not priests by calling, but by inheritance or assignment. Some were bound laborers, working for the temple in exchange for food, shelter, or social status. Children might be trained in temple schools, learning hymns, rituals, and the cuneiform script. In total, a single ziggurat complex could involve hundreds of individuals across dozens of roles, making it one of the largest employers in any given Mesopotamian city. Foreign kings and ziggurat restoration. Later rulers, including Kassite, Assyrian, and Persian kings, understood the symbolic power of the ziggurat. For example, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon, 7th century BCE, recorded restoring the ziggurat of Babylon even though his father, Sennacherib, had once destroyed it. Cyrus the Great of Persia, after conquering Babylon in 539 BCE, claimed divine favor from Marduk and likely supported ziggurat worship at least symbolically to ensure local loyalty. This continuity reveals the deep theological and political resonance of the ziggurat, even as empires changed hands. To restore a ziggurat was to restore order not just civic, but cosmic. Ziggurats in the imagination. By the Hellenistic period, Mesopotamian ziggurats had entered myth. Greek historians like Herodotus wrote about a great temple tower in Babylon, describing its multiple levels and spiral ascent. Later traditions identified the ruined Etemenenki with the Tower of Babel, the biblical story of human pride punished by divine confusion. This identification is not exact, but it reveals how the image of the ziggurat endured as a symbol of human ambition, cosmic communication, sacred architecture. Even in ruin, these towers remain charged with meaning. Closing thought. Beneath the step terraces and sacred bricks, the ziggurat was not just a structure. It was an ongoing performance, a rhythm of ascent, offering, and return. And so we must ask, was the ziggurat built to hold up the sky, or to remind people of how much labor it takes to keep the heavens in place? The sun sets over the plain. A breeze kicks dust across half-buried brickwork. Shepherds pass ruins where priests once sang hymns and where kings carved their names into clay. The ziggurat, now eroded and silent, still casts a shadow. Even broken, it demands reverence. We examine the decline, abandonment, and rediscovery of the ziggurats, how they slipped from living centers of worship to forgotten mounds, and yet continued to shape memory, myth, and archaeology across millennia. The long decline. Ziggurats did not fall in a single event. Their decline was gradual, tied to shifts in political control, economic instability, and the slow erosion of the Mesopotamian religious worldview. By the late 1st millennium BCE, foreign empires, first the Assyrians, then Babylonians, then Persians, held sway over Mesopotamia. Many of them supported temple institutions for political purposes, but the intensity of devotion waned. Later still, under Seleucid and Parthian rule, Greek culture brought new architectural and religious models. Temples were still built, but the ziggurat as a form faded. The celestial, tiered mountain gave way to ground-level shrines, colonnaded halls, and imported gods. The last known references to active ziggurat use date from around 300 BCE. By then, even the great Etemenenki of Babylon, possibly the tallest ziggurat ever built, had begun to crumble. It was damaged by war, neglect, and finally robbed of bricks to build new cities under new rulers. The silence of the gods. As religious authority shifted from local cults to imperial ideologies, and later to monotheistic systems, the old temples lost their meaning. No longer visited by priests, no longer honored in festival, no longer cleansed, repaired, or named in official records, Abandonment was not just physical, it was cosmic. In the Mesopotamian imagination, a ziggurat without a god was not merely an empty building. It was a breach in the divine order, a sign that the world had changed irreversibly. Some laments from the late periods reflect this sense of loss. The gods have withdrawn. Their shrines are dust. The smoke no longer rises. In these texts, cities weep, temples cry out, and gods wander no longer bound to sacred homes, but displaced, mourned, and silent. The Tower of Babel and cultural memory. Centuries after the last brick was laid, the ziggurat reappeared not in form, but in story. The Tower of Babel, found in the Hebrew Bible Genesis 11, describes a structure built by humans seeking to reach the heavens. In the tale, God scatters their languages, halting construction and punishing their ambition. This story likely reflects cultural memory of ziggurats, specifically Babylon's Etemenenki, the tallest and most famous. The biblical account doesn't mention ziggurats by name, but the stepped architecture, religious ambition, and divine reaction parallel earlier Mesopotamian themes. The belief that tall temples connected heaven and earth. The risk of hubris in crossing divine boundaries. The mixing of tongues as divine response. In this way, the ziggurat entered mythical memory not as architecture, but as symbol. Archaeological rediscovery. By the 19th century CE, Western explorers and archaeologists began excavating Mesopotamian sites. The mounds they uncovered, once thought to be natural hills, revealed traces of massive, tiered structures. In British archaeologist Leonard Woolley uncovered the ziggurat of in the 1920s. Beneath layers of sand and silt, he found a multi-tiered base with a grand central stair, remnants of baked brick with bitumen mortar, inscribed foundation tablets naming Namu and Shulgi, drainage systems, platforms, and retaining walls. These discoveries confirmed what had long been speculated. The stepped towers of ancient texts were real and massive. Subsequent digs in Babylon, Eridu, Nippur, and Chaghazanbel Elam expanded the map. Each ziggurat, in its own ruinous way, told a different story of different gods, cities, and dynasties. Ziggurats in the modern mind. Today, ziggurats are not living temples, but they remain powerful images. They appear in museum reconstructions and scale models, textbooks on the cradle of civilization, fictional adaptations and films, art and architecture inspired by Mesopotamian geometry, comparative religion and mythology studies. In some places, the name ziggurat has been used to describe modern buildings with stepped profiles, government offices, monuments, even data centers. And in the digital realm, where ancient texts have been digitized and rendered in 3D models, the ziggurat has become a kind of virtual pilgrimage site climbed by the curious rather than the pious. The poetic afterlife. In the end, the ziggurat is remembered not just for what it was, but for what it tried to do, to connect. Sky to earth, human to divine, king to God, ritual to time, past to future. It failed perhaps in the long run. The gods no longer live in shrines, the festivals are silent, the bricks lie in ruin. But still something remains, a shape, a name, a purpose etched into collective memory. In that sense, the ziggurat continues to function not as a temple, but as a symbol of longing, of the human desire to climb, to reach, to understand, and to worship. Final reflection. The ziggurat was made of humble clay. It cracked in the sun. It softened in the rain. And yet it carried the weight of the cosmos layered with faith, power, ritual, and memory. So we are left with one quiet question. In every civilization, do we not build towers real or symbolic to remind ourselves that the divine may still dwell just beyond the top step? Story 4. The Priest Kings of Lagash, Religion and Rule. The year is somewhere around 2100 BCE, in the waning days of Sumerian independence. The empire of Akkad has crumbled. The great kings of earlier dynasties are gone, and Mesopotamia is again a land of city-states, each ruled not by emperors, but by something older, something sacred, the priest-king, or Ensi. And among these rulers, one name stands out, Gudea of Lagash. Not because he conquered lands, he did not. Not because he wrote epic poetry, he did not. But because he ruled in devotion, building temples, composing inscriptions, and presenting himself not as a god, but as the humble servant of the gods. We explore the hybrid identity of the priest-king in ancient Lagash, half-ruler, half-priest, governing not by force, but by ritual, construction, and submission to divine will. The city of Lagash. Nestled between the rivers in what is today southern Iraq, Lagash was one of the oldest and most important Sumerian city-states. By Gudea's time, the city had already seen centuries of turmoil. Wars with neighbors like Umma, shifts in watercourses, and the collapse of Akkadian hegemony had left it vulnerable. And yet it endured through its temples, its canals, and its steadfast devotion to its patron god, Ningirsu. Ningirsu, a warrior god, was associated with storms, agriculture, and victory. His temple in Lagash, called Ninu, House of the 50, was the spiritual heart of the city. When Gudea came to power, perhaps through lineage, perhaps through appointment, it was to this god that he turned. The Ensi, priest-king of the city. In many Sumerian cities, the king bore the title Lugal, meaning great man or sovereign. But in Lagash, the leader was known as Ensi, a term that implies both rulership and religious stewardship. The Ensi was not just a governor. He was the caretaker of the temple, the intermediary between the god and the people. His job was not to rule with power, but to rule with piety. Gudea embraced this role with intensity. Unlike the empire-building kings before him, he cast himself as a humble servant, obedient to Ningirsu, guided by omens, dreams, and the commands of the divine world. In doing so, he transformed politics into devotion, and left behind one of the most detailed records of temple building in all of Mesopotamian history. Gudea statues, the king in stone. More than a dozen statues of Gudea survive, carved from imported diorite, a hard stone sourced from distant lands. These seated figures, often showing the king with folded hands, a peaceful expression, and a tablet on his lap, are not warlike. They are contemplative, devotional, and permanent. In the inscriptions carved on their backs and hems, Gudea details his building of Ningirsu's temple. I made it gleam like the heavens. I made it bright as the stars. I purified the temple and restored the me of the gods. The me, those divine laws or decrees, were not just ideas. They were spiritual blueprints. By building according to the me, Gudea restored the balance between gods and men. Each statue was a prayer in stone, not just an image of himself, but a stand-in for his eternal worship. Dreams and omens, divine instruction. According to inscriptions, Gudea began the construction of Ningirsu's temple only after receiving a dream. In it, a divine figure showed him the plans, complete with measurements and celestial guidance. This dream wasn't merely personal, it was political theology. It proved that Gudea had divine sanction for his work. He wasn't imposing his will, he was fulfilling Ningirsu's command. Before building, he sought omens. He consulted diviners, interpreted signs in the liver of sacrificial animals, watched the stars. Only when the signs were right did he begin construction. In this way, every brick laid was an act of obedience, not ambition. The economics of temple building. Though humble in tone, Gudea's building project was massive. His inscriptions mention timber from the mountains of Lebanon, copper and gold from Anatolia and Iran, stones from Magan, possibly Oman, laborers and artisans organized across city districts. This was no isolated temple. It was a cosmic center, reflecting the wide economic networks of Mesopotamia, and it reveals Gudea not only as a priest, but as a logistician, coordinating trade, transport, and workforce across thousands of kilometers. Yet even here, Gudea refuses credit. He insists it was all for Ningirsu, directed by the god's will, not his own. A king who did not deify himself. Unlike Sargon or Naram-Sin, Gudea did not declare himself divine. He did not build temples to his own name. He did not portray himself in battle. He wrote in calm, respectful prose. His statues are serene. His hands are folded, not raised in conquest but in prayer. This sets him apart. In a time when kings were beginning to claim godhood, Gudea claimed service. In doing so, he positioned himself as a model of ideal kingship, not as a tyrant, but as a conduit for divine stability. The architecture of order. The Eninu temple was designed not merely for grandeur, but for cosmic alignment. Its foundations were ritually purified with offerings and chants. Its bricks were stamped with sacred inscriptions. Its layout followed sacred geometry, aligning with stars, cardinal directions, and the city's axis. Ceremonial gates, halls, and sanctuaries were planned according to divine measurements revealed in the dream. The temple was not just a building, it was a replica of the heavens, a machine for sustaining order, and a stage for the god's daily presence. Closing thought. So we see Gudea, not as a warrior king, not as a conqueror, but as a builder, a priest, a dreamer with a tablet who shaped a city through reverent labor and sacred text. But we must now ask, in a world of rising warlords and collapsing empires, could humble piety alone preserve a kingdom, or was Gudea's vision already fading beneath the weight of history? The soft glow of the moon falls over Lagash. In the temple precinct, workers stack bricks late into the evening. Musicians practice sacred melodies for the god Ningirsu's feast day. The great ziggurat looms silently in the distance, a stairway of devotion constructed not in haste, but through years of effort and ritual observance. This is the world of Gudea's Lagash, a city not held together by soldiers, but by priests, laborers, and sacred law. In this section, we examine what it truly meant to build a city under divine mandate, and how Gudea's reign forged a deeply religious form of kingship that rested on faith, order, and practical governance. A temple built by the gods through men. Gudea's inscriptions describe the construction of Ningirsu's temple, the Eninu, in exhaustive detail. He names not just the gods, but the materials, people, tools, and techniques used. According to the records, materials came from diorite from Magan, possibly Oman, cedar and other fine woods from the Levant, copper and precious metals from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from the east, possibly Afghanistan. To acquire these, Gudea sent caravans and trade expeditions, forging alliances or reopening ancient trade routes long neglected during the chaos after the fall of Akkad. But rather than glorify his own achievements, he consistently framed these feats as divine assistance. It was Ningirsu, he says, who opened the roads, who brought the mountains low, and who gathered the people. The people labored because it was a sacred task. The god was not simply watching, he was participating, through signs, omens, and dreams. Organizing the sacred workforce. Temple building in Lagash was not merely a construction project. It was a statewide religious operation, involving every sector of the city-state. Craftsmen prepared votive statues, door fittings, ritual vessels. Scribes recorded every offering, every brick laid, every worker assigned. Priests purified the site, supervised omens, and led dedications. Farmers and fishers paid temple taxes in barley, goats, or oil to support the workers. Women were involved as weavers, brewers, and singers in temple service. These duties weren't always voluntary. Some citizens owed corvée labor temporary state service in lieu of taxes. Yet because the project was framed as a divine mission, participation also became a kind of civic piety. By involving the entire city, Gudea transformed construction into ritual performance, with every laborer acting out a cosmic script. Rituals embedded in stone. Every phase of the temple's construction was governed by ritual law. Foundation rituals involved sacrifices, libations, and placement of sacred deposits, inscribed tablets, tiny votive models of tools, even figurines. Cornerstones were aligned with the cardinal directions. Brick molds were washed and consecrated. First bricks were laid with ceremonial chants, under the guidance of augurs. Offerings were embedded in walls to feed the building with divine essence. Even the brick stamps used to mark each clay unit were inscribed with Gudea's name and titles, along with phrases like, "For Ningirsu, the warrior of Enlil, Gudea Ensi of Lagash, built his temple with reverent hands." These marks weren't about vanity. They served as eternal prayers, repeated through the very materials of the structure. The Ininu, a house of many functions. The finished temple complex was more than a shrine. It was a central node of economic, political, and spiritual activity. It included a ziggurat platform with a shrine at its summit, courtyards for rituals and processions, storehouses for grain, oil, wool, and offerings, residential quarters for temple staff, workshops, kitchens, and breweries to support the daily cult. The temple acted as a bank storing wealth in kind, a distribution center allocating rations and goods, a school where scribes trained in sacred songs were taught, a theater of the divine where gods were honored through ritual drama. At the center of it all stood the god Ningirsu, embodied in his statue, and maintained through daily ritual a reflection of divine presence and political stability. Gudea's ethical vision. Beyond his building projects, Gudea's inscriptions reveal something more, a moral worldview. He declared that under his rule, widows were not left without bread, orphans were not cast out, the strong did not oppress the weak, weights and measures were honest, temples were not defiled. These proclamations appear frequently in Mesopotamian royal inscriptions, but in Gudea's case, the tone is notably personal, almost pastoral. He describes himself not as a ruler wielding force, but as a guardian of order and justice. He enacted remission of debts, ensured ritual purity, and invoked divine favor not through conquest but through construction, administration, and fairness. Statues as prayerful agents. To preserve his presence long after death, Gudea commissioned numerous statues, each carefully inscribed, each placed in a sacred precinct. In one inscription he writes, "May my statue speak in my stead. May it call out my reverence for Ningirsu in the days to come." These were not just portraits. They were ritual surrogates standing in temple courts as perpetual worshippers, continuing Gudea's piety even in death. They depict him not in armor but in simple robes. His hands are always clasped. His head is often shaved, eyes wide in contemplation. On his lap is sometimes a tablet bearing the plan of the temple, a divine blueprint, symbolizing obedience, intellect, and religious duty. Legacy beyond his reign. Gudea ruled for at least 2 decades, perhaps longer. His reign was relatively peaceful. There are no records of wars. His inscriptions never boast of conquest. Instead, they speak of righteous rule, careful administration, and temple dedication. In later times, his name remained associated with ideal kingship, a ruler who worked in service of the gods and protected the spiritual order of his people. Though the precise dates and events of his rule are debated, the sheer volume of inscriptions and statues he left behind suggests a deep desire to be remembered not for power, but for piety. Closing thought. As we walk among the ruins of ancient Lagash, past the broken bricks once stamped with Gudya's prayers, we are left to wonder. Can a city be held together not by armies or law, but by devotion alone, stacked one brick at a time? In the dry silence of southern Mesopotamia, the city of Lagash eventually faded. Its canals silted, its temples crumbled, its inscriptions lay buried under dust and centuries. And yet, the name Gudea endured not as a warlord or conqueror, but as a man who once ruled through reverence, law, and sacred construction. We examine how Gudea's legacy lived on not in imperial conquest, but in ritual memory, spiritual influence, and the enduring image of the priest-king, as a figure of balance between the human and the divine. After Gudea, the shifting political landscape. Shortly after Gudea's reign, Mesopotamia once again entered a period of consolidation. The rise of the Ur-II dynasty under Ur-Nammu around 2112 BCE marked the return of centralized monarchy and broader territorial ambitions. Ur-Nammu and his successors reasserted the Lugal king title and built monumental structures, including the ziggurat of Ur. Their rule combined religious devotion with imperial expansion. In this context, Gudea's modest, temple-focused kingship may have seemed anachronistic, out of place in a world moving back toward empire and military power. And yet he was remembered. Later scribes included his name in king lists. His inscriptions were recopied. His statues remained standing in sacred spaces for centuries, passive witnesses to a changing world. Gudea's image as a model of kingship. The Sumerians valued not only power, but order, what they called Mi and Namtar, the destinies and decrees that governed everything from the movement of stars to the duties of a fisherman. Gudea, in his writings, repeatedly shows himself as one who upholds that order. He listens to the gods. He interprets their dreams. He builds according to divine blueprints. He ensures justice and fairness. Later kings adopted many of these rhetorical tools. Even Hammurabi, king of Babylon some 200 years later, framed his famous law code as a gift from the sun god Shamash, declaring himself not an autocrat but a shepherd of justice. In this way, Gudea's tone of pious rulership set a precedent, one where a king's authority flowed from ritual obedience and social care, not simply from military might. Temples as timeless legacies. The Temple of Ninnu, built under Gudea's direction, remained an active religious site for generations. Its memory was so enduring that even in the Neo-Babylonian period, some 1,500 years later, rulers such as Nebuchadnezzar II referenced the restoration of older sacred sites in Lagash and Girsu, the twin cities that Gudea once served. Though the bricks of Ninnu eventually gave way to ruin, the concept of the temple as a cosmic engine, a sacred home, and a political cornerstone persisted throughout Mesopotamian history. Even the Achaemenid Persians, foreign rulers with their own gods, understood the importance of supporting temple institutions. Gudea's model of temple-centric rulership was thus adaptable, surviving regime changes and cultural shifts. Rediscovery in the modern era. It wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries CE that Gudea's name re-emerged from history. Archaeological excavations at Tello, ancient Girsu, uncovered dozens of Gudea statues, many in near-perfect condition. Inscriptions on clay cylinders, detailing temple construction. Brick stamps bearing his titles and prayers. Foundation deposits with votive figures, tools, and dedication texts. These finds revealed a ruler who had once been forgotten, but who had spoken clearly through the permanence of stone and clay. Today, Gudea's statues sit in museums in Paris, London, and Baghdad, not as relics of empire, but as artifacts of devotional governance. The priest-king as an enduring archetype. The figure of the priest-king, one who governs both body and soul, city and shrine is rare in history. Most rulers have chosen the sword. Gudea chose the brick, the tablet, and the dream. His model survives in later ideas. The pharaoh as divine intercessor in Egypt. The biblical king anointed by prophets. The medieval monarch as God's lieutenant on earth. Even modern political leaders invoking moral or spiritual justification for their rule. But none are quite like Gudea, who explicitly declined deification, whose inscriptions lack violence, and whose reign was remembered for temple building, justice, and sacred administration. A quiet kind of power. In a region defined by conquest, Gudea's legacy stands out for its gentleness. He prayed instead of boasting. He organized instead of expanding. He built instead of burned. He listened instead of commanded. Even in his iconography, we see not triumph but serenity, folded hands, calm eyes, seated posture. He ruled not as a god, but as one in service to the divine, and that choice, uncommon then and now, resonates. Final reflection. The mud-brick cities of Sumer are long gone. Their temples lie in ruin. Their gods are silent. But the inscriptions endure, and so does the image of Gudea, half forgotten, half immortal. And so we are left with a simple question. In a world that celebrates might, how often do we remember the rulers who simply built, prayed, and served? Story 5. Nippur, the Holy City and the Politics of Pilgrimage. When ancient Mesopotamians spoke of Nippur, they did so with reverence, not because of its walls or its armies, but because it was the spiritual axis of their world. It was a city dedicated not to conquest or commerce, but to Enlil, the storm god, the divine commander, the one who decreed kingship. Unlike Ur or Akkad or Babylon, Nippur was not a seat of political power. It had no empire. It issued no royal edicts. Yet no king could rule legitimately without first securing Enlil's blessing from Nippur. We explore the unique religious status of Nippur, a city that stood apart as the divine center of gravity, drawing kings, pilgrims, and priests across the centuries. The god Enlil, voice of the decrees. At the heart of Nippur's sacred significance was Enlil, one of the oldest and most powerful gods in the Sumerian pantheon. Where Anu ruled the distant heavens and Enki the waters below, Enlil ruled the space in between, the world of wind, air, storm, and fate. He was the god of command, the holder of the me, or divine decrees. Enlil did not often appear in personal prayers. He was not warm. He was distant, bureaucratic, absolute. His power was impersonal, the way a law or flood is impersonal. And his temple, the Ikur, House of the Mountain, located in Nippur, was the place where those decrees were issued. The Ikur Temple, center of the sacred landscape. The Ikur wasn't just another temple. It was a cosmic anchor, often referred to in texts as the bond between heaven and earth. This made Nippur more than a city. It was the navel of the world, the fixed point through which divine authority passed. The Ikur complex included a ziggurat serving as a divine stairway, a grand courtyard where ceremonies and sacrifices occurred, living quarters and administrative spaces for priests, scribes, and temple workers, archives filled with cuneiform tablets, prayers, rituals, economic records, sacred gardens and canals symbolizing divine abundance. Every architectural detail echoed the order of the cosmos. The Ikur wasn't built for public worship. It was the house of Enlil, and the rituals performed there maintained the balance of the world. A city of priests, not kings. Nippur was unusual in that it was not typically governed by its own monarch. It was run by a priestly class, often loyal to whoever ruled Mesopotamia at the time, but maintaining a certain independence of function. This made Nippur both neutral and sacred. Even rival kings who despised each other might recognize Nippur's significance and contribute to its upkeep. Rulers such as Ur-Nammu of Ur, Sargon of Akkad, Shulgi, Hammurabi, Ashurbanipal of Assyria, and even Persian kings. All funded restorations of Nippur's temples, sent offerings, and made pilgrimages to seek Enlil's favor. To rebuild or honor Nippur was not simply pious, it was politically necessary. Kingship confirmed at Nippur. It became tradition that a king's rule was not legitimate unless recognized by Enlil, which meant offering gifts at Nippur, supporting its priesthood, and possibly even undergoing ritual confirmation there. Texts often describe kings as shepherd chosen by Enlil, beloved of Enlil, having received the scepter at Nippur. This concept tied divine approval to the very geography of Nippur. A crown in Akkad or Babylon meant little if Enlil had not sanctioned it. Some rulers even attributed their military victories or political stability directly to Enlil's favor, a favor earned in part by supporting the holy city. Pilgrimage and procession. For the ordinary Mesopotamian, Nippur was also a destination for pilgrimage. Families might visit to offer sacrifices for health or fertility, fulfill vows or personal prayers, participate in seasonal festivals. While the inner temple remained off-limits to most, outer precincts and shrines were open to pilgrims. Offerings were recorded by scribes. Statues of worshippers' hands folded. Names inscribed were left in courtyards or gateways. Festival processions likely moved through the streets, carrying statues of gods, accompanied by music, incense, and prayers. These festivals offered moments of unity when the elite and commoners, kings and laborers, could witness the gods in motion. And in the center of it all stood the Ikur, quiet and imposing, receiving tribute not just from individuals, but from all of Mesopotamia. Nippur in literature and theology. Nippur appears frequently in Mesopotamian literature. In creation hymns, it is called the place where destinies are decreed. In royal inscriptions, it is the seat of Enlil's command. In Lamentations, its fall is portrayed as the collapse of the cosmic order itself. To destroy Nippur was not merely military aggression, it was sacrilege. To restore Nippur was not just piety, it was restoring balance to the world. These ideas made Nippur a theological constant, regardless of political chaos. A different kind of power. Nippur never raised armies. It never imposed tribute. It had no kings or territorial ambitions, and yet it commanded universal respect. Its power was not in dominance, but in symbolism. It reminded every ruler that their authority came from something higher, something beyond themselves, a force rooted not in gold or grain, but in the decrees of the storm god written on the wind. Closing thought. So we return to this sacred city, neither capital nor fortress, and yet essential. As its priests tended fires and its scribes shaped clay, the fate of kings hung silently in the air. And we are left to wonder, can a city ruled by no king, guarded by no army, shape history more profoundly than any throne of stone? The dry plains of Sumer stretch endlessly, broken only by the glint of canal water and the rising mounds of ancient cities. Among them, Nippur stands apart not for its wealth or might, but because it was a city where kings set aside their crowns, where priests outlasted dynasties, and where the storm god Enlil's silent authority kept rulers humble. We explore the daily life of Nippur as a functioning religious capital, the mechanisms by which it maintained neutrality, and the political theater of ritual diplomacy that made the city essential to every Mesopotamian regime. Governing a city without a king. Unlike other major cities in Sumer, Nippur was not ruled by a monarch. There was no royal palace, no lugal king residing in its ziggurat shadow. Instead, the city was administered by a powerful temple bureaucracy, headed by a high priest or priestly governor appointed often indirectly by reigning kings from other cities. This arrangement served multiple purposes. Neutrality. With no local king, Nippur could serve as a sacred meeting ground for rival powers. Continuity. Priesthoods were stable institutions, surviving even when dynasties fell. Theocratic legitimacy. The priests served Enlil, not human rulers. Their authority was rooted in divine tradition. Over time, this priestly administration developed a complex hierarchy of scribes, administrators, and ritual experts. The temple records of Nippur are among the most extensive ever found in Mesopotamia, preserving thousands of tablets detailing everything from goat deliveries to planetary movements. Daily rituals and temple operations. The Temple of Enlil, the Ekur, functioned as a machine of devotion each day, regulated by ceremonies that maintained cosmic balance. Some of the rituals performed daily or seasonally included lustrations and purifications, cleansing rituals for the temple, statues, and priesthood. Incense burnings, offerings of fragrant smoke to Enlil in the early morning. Musical recitations. Priests trained in sacred chants would recite Sumerian hymns, accompanied by harps and lyres. Food offerings. Bread, beer, dates, and meat laid before the god's statue, then redistributed as rations to temple staff. Liver divination, extispicy. Before major decisions, priests examined the livers of sacrificed animals for signs from the gods. These rituals weren't symbolic, they were understood to be operational necessities, the invisible infrastructure that kept the universe in motion. Temple economy and wealth. Despite its lack of political power, Nippur was economically formidable. The temple complex owned vast tracts of land leased to tenant farmers. It employed herdsmen to manage temple flocks, fishermen and boatmen for canal and river resources, metalworkers, potters, and textile producers, scribes for accounting and archival work. Goods and produce flowed into the temple from these holdings, which the priests then redistributed as offerings or wages. The tablet archives of Nippur, discovered in the late 19th century at Tel Nufar, reveal this economic engine in astonishing detail. Some tablets are routine: 3 goats delivered for festival, 2 acceptable, 1 unfit, while others record contracts, lawsuits, and even donations from kings of distant lands. This economic web gave the temple enormous pragmatic leverage. Its cooperation was needed not only for religious legitimacy, but also for grain, livestock, and scribal talent. The pilgrimage of kings. Even when not at war, Mesopotamian kings made ceremonial visits to Nippur. These pilgrimages served multiple political purposes. Divine sanction, reaffirmed their kingship through Enlil's blessing. Display of piety, reinforced their image as humble, God-fearing rulers. Public relations, ensure temple support and positive mentions in religious hymns. Omens and divination, seek answers from Enlil before undertaking major campaigns or reforms. The visits were choreographed events. A king would arrive bearing rich gifts: gold, silver, lapis lazuli, incense. He might commission temple repairs, sponsor festivals, or donate land. These acts were recorded on commemorative clay cones, bricks, and stelae. In return, the priests might declare that the king was chosen by Enlil, whose shadow brings peace, whose feet tread the path of justice. Even if the king never ruled Nippur, such phrases gave his regime religious credibility that no city conquest could match. The fragile art of neutrality. Nippur's neutrality was strategic but fragile. Being holy did not make the city invulnerable. Over the centuries, it was attacked, looted, and rebuilt multiple times. Yet each time, conquering kings saw value in restoring its sacred function rather than destroying it entirely. For example, after the collapse of Akkad, Nippur was sacked, yet rulers from rebuilt it. When Babylon took over Sumer, they restored the Ekur and emphasized continuity with older traditions. During Assyrian occupation, Nippur remained active as a religious center. Even the Achaemenid Persians made offerings there, acknowledging its unique position. This pattern destruction followed by restoration reveals how Nippur's power transcended politics. Each empire knew that to erase Nippur was to undermine its own divine authority. Nippur in the eyes of the people. To common Mesopotamians, Nippur may have felt like a distant, mythical city, a place whispered about during festivals, where gods decreed destinies and kings humbled themselves. Yet evidence shows that many ordinary people made journeys to Nippur, especially during seasonal festivals. The Akaitam, a New Year festival held in several cities, may have had its theological origins in rituals performed in Nippur, involving symbolic reenactments of the gods' granting of kingship. Clay figurines and inscriptions from non-royal individuals attest to the personal spiritual investment in the holy city. In a world dominated by uncertainty, floods, drought, war, disease, Nippur was a place where fate was named, recorded, and sometimes altered. A temple beyond time. By 1600 BCE, as Sumerian gradually gave way to Akkadian, and later Aramaic, Nippur remained active. Even when the central power moved to Babylon or Nineveh, even when Enlil was replaced in prominence by Marduk, Nippur's temples continued. Its role had shifted from universal center to regional shrine, then to historical monument, and finally to symbol. But it never vanished completely. The memory of Nippur, inscribed on clay, was passed down not just in history, but in ritual thought, theological ideas, and administrative models. Closing thought. As the sun sets over the reed-lined canals, and the scent of incense lingers in the courtyards, Nippur reminds us that some cities shape history not by force but by being the place everyone must visit, everyone must honor, and no one may truly possess. And so we ask, can a city maintain influence precisely because it does not rule, because it chooses to remain sacred, still, and untouchable? The story of Nippur does not end with conquest, nor does it vanish in a single fire or flood. Instead, its influence lingers, slowly eroded, occasionally revived, but never entirely forgotten. In this final section, we examine the centuries of resilience, adaptation, and rediscovery that allowed Nippur to endure, both physically and spiritually, even as the great empires of Mesopotamia came and went. A city that refused to die. Unlike cities built for military or economic reasons, Nippur's survival did not depend on political dominance. Its importance lay in its spiritual reputation, and that reputation was durable. After the fall of the Ur-II dynasty around 2004 BCE, Nippur entered a period of decline. The Ekur suffered damage. Some temple functions lapsed, but Nippur was never truly abandoned. During the Old Babylonian period, rulers like Hammurabi continued to refer to Nippur in their inscriptions, invoking Enlil's name in royal titles. The temple archives of Nippur continued to be updated with new economic records, and its priestly schools trained scribes in both Sumerian and Akkadian. Even as cities like Babylon, Uruk, and Nineveh rose to dominance, Nippur remained a quiet constant, providing historical continuity in a changing world. Nippur under foreign rule. By the first millennium BCE, Mesopotamia had become a patchwork of empires: Assyrian, Babylonian, and later Persian. Through all these transitions, Nippur maintained its ritual identity, sometimes diminished, sometimes revived. Assyrian kings such as Ashurbanipal sponsored restorations in Nippur, linking their own authority to the ancient gods of Sumer. Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon, known for rebuilding much of Mesopotamia, contributed to Nippur's upkeep, even as the center of worship shifted toward Marduk. Under Achaemenid Persian rule, Nippur continued as a local religious hub. The Persians allowed temples to function, recognizing their role in maintaining local stability. Even when foreign rulers had no personal devotion to Enlil, they understood Nippur's symbolic value. It anchored Mesopotamian legitimacy. The long decline. By the time of Alexander the Great's conquest in the 4th century BCE, Nippur was a shell of its former self. The rise of Hellenistic culture, followed by Parthian and Sasanian rule, introduced new religious ideas. The gods of old were increasingly forgotten, and temples like the Ekur ceased their rituals. But even in decline, Nippur's memory endured. Local populations may have continued to treat the ruins as sacred. Fragments of prayers, rituals, and hymns survived in scribal copies, passed down through centuries. Clay tablets buried in the temple archives remained protected by their very obscurity, waiting for rediscovery. Rediscovery by the modern world. Nippur was rediscovered in the late 19th century by American archaeologists working under the University of Pennsylvania. Beginning in 1889, they excavated Tel Nafar, uncovering the remains of the Ekur temple complex. Thousands of cuneiform tablets, economic records, hymns, literary works. Broken statues and foundation, deposits from the reigns of kings long thought mythical. Layers of occupation spanning nearly 2,000 years of continuous use. The Nippur expedition marked one of the earliest systematic American archaeological efforts in the Middle East. Its discoveries revolutionized our understanding of Sumerian civilization. Among the most valuable finds were the Sumerian king list, tablets containing portions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and countless administrative records showing how temple society functioned. Ironically, the very qualities that made Nippur seem boring, its scribal culture, temple economics, and ritual conservatism, proved invaluable to historians seeking to understand daily life in ancient Mesopotamia. Lessons from a sacred bureaucracy. Nippur was a city of rules, routines, and rituals. It did not inspire heroic legends or grand military exploits, but it documented everything. From grain rations to property sales, from priestly appointments to moon phases, Nippur wrote it all down. This record-keeping preserved an entire worldview, one where time was cyclical, where the divine ordered every aspect of existence, and where human society functioned only when aligned with the decrees of the gods. In a way, Nippur teaches us the value of slow, methodical reverence. There were no sudden triumphs here, only the quiet hum of daily rituals, repeated over centuries. The legacy of Enlil's city. Today, few remember Enlil or the priests of Nippur, but their legacy persists in subtler ways. In the idea that law and governance should have moral grounding. In the concept of religious centers as neutral, unifying forces. In the use of pilgrimage and ritual to create shared identity across diverse populations. Nippur reminds us that power doesn't always come from force. Sometimes, it comes from being the place others must return to, the site where legitimacy begins, the city that holds memory when all else changes. Final reflection. As we look back on Nippur's long, quiet history from sacred summit to crumbled mound, we must ask, is it the cities that conquer, or the ones that outlast, which truly shape the course of civilization? Story 6. The temples of Eridu, water, wisdom, and the first city. Before there was before there was Uruk, before Lagash or Nippur or Akkad, there was Eridu. In the ancient minds of the Sumerians, Eridu was the first city, founded by the gods themselves. It sat not in the heart of bustling trade routes or along imperial roads, but on the edge of a marshy coastline, where the waters of the Euphrates met the vast, salty southern sea. Here, amid the reeds and shifting silt, the first temple to the god Enki was built small at first, then rebuilt again and again over centuries until it became a layered mound of devotion. In this first section, we trace the origins of Eridu, explore its mythic role in Sumerian thought, and uncover how this watery outpost laid the foundations for all that followed. The myth of Eridu, a city given by the gods. According to the Sumerian king list, kingship descended from heaven to Eridu first. This phrasing is not poetic, it reflects a genuine belief that civilization began at Eridu. And not just civilization, but the very concept of order, of culture, of structure. In Sumerian mythology, Enki, or E as later Akkadians called him, was the god of freshwater and subterranean aquifers, Abzu, wisdom, crafts, and creation, magic, healing, and civilization itself. It was in Eridu that Enki was believed to have lived, in a temple palace made of reeds and stone, situated at the watery edge of the world. From here, he dispensed the divine decrees that governed life, technology, and human behavior. As one Sumerian hymn proclaims, Eridu, the holy city, your foundation is laid in the Abzu. Your temple rises like a mountain. Enki, Lord of wisdom, dwells within. To visit Eridu, then, was not simply to enter a city, it was to step into myth. The geography of beginnings. In reality, Eridu was located near the present-day site of Tel Abu Sharin in southern Iraq. In ancient times, it lay close to the shores of the Persian Gulf, before centuries of sediment pushed the coastline farther south. The surrounding environment was a blend of marshland, estuary, and desert, a challenging place to build a city. But this watery world was sacred, especially to those who believed that all life sprang from the primordial deep. Early settlers used reeds, mud bricks, and bitumen to construct homes and ritual spaces. Over time, as the temple to Enki was rebuilt and expanded, it created a tell, or layered mound of earth and architecture. Beneath the ruins, archaeologists have uncovered over 18 architectural layers of temples, one atop the other, each slightly larger or more elaborate than the last. These layers span more than 2,000 years of occupation, beginning as early as 5000 BCE. The Temple of Enki, from shrine to monument. The earliest version of the temple at Eridu was just a single-room shrine, likely made of reeds, perhaps even floating slightly on the waterlogged ground. But this humble structure was revered and repeatedly rebuilt, each time with more permanence. By the 3rd millennium BCE, the temple had grown to include multiple rooms for offerings and storage, courtyards for ritual gatherings, altars and fire pits for burnt offerings, drainage channels to carry away sacred water, clay cone mosaics for decorative walls, statues and votive figures of worshippers. Each rebuilding phase respected the footprint of the last, suggesting that the people of Eridu saw their city as anchored in divine tradition. Change was allowed, but only as an echo of the past. This practice of rebuilding the same temple, layer by layer, became a template for sacred architecture across Mesopotamia, most notably in the ziggurats of later cities. Enki, the god who let things slip. Enki was not like Enlil or Anu, distant, thundering, and absolute. He was wily, clever, and often subversive. In myths, Enki is the one who created humans from clay and divine blood, secretly gave forbidden knowledge to humans, saved humanity during a great flood, helped the goddess Inanna gain power by trickery. His character reflected the unpredictability of water, at times nurturing, at times overwhelming. His wisdom was not moralistic, but pragmatic, survival through adaptation, cunning over brute strength. Eridu as his city mirrored these themes. It was never the richest or the most powerful, but it lasted, adapting to floods, climate shifts, and the rise of rival cities by holding fast to its ritual significance. Life at the edge of the world. Daily life in Eridu was not glamorous. Residents contended with salty soil that limited farming, mosquitoes and disease from stagnant water, frequent flooding from rivers and rising tides, heat, wind, and dust from the desert's edge. Yet people lived here for generations. They built homes from reeds, harvested fish, and traded with inland and coastal settlements. Some may have served the temple as priests, scribes, or craftsmen. Others worked the surrounding marshlands as hunters, foragers, and herders. Clay tablets, while rare in the earliest periods, suggest a functioning administrative system by the 3rd millennium BCE. Even in hard conditions, ritual gave life structure. The cycle of offering, rebuilding, and remembrance linked the present to the gods and to the deep, mythic past. The rise of rival cities. By 3000 BCE, cities like Uruk, and Lagash began to outshine Eridu economically and politically. Their kings built towering temples, developed law codes, and waged wars. Their scribes composed epics and hymns that became the backbone of Mesopotamian literature. Eridu did not compete. Instead, it retained its reputation as the first city, the spiritual birthplace of civilization. In the Sumerian creation myth Enki and the world order, Enki travels from Eridu to the other cities, distributing gifts of technology, law, and function. He is the originator, not the conqueror. This mythic framing gave Eridu a kind of timeless prestige. Later kings continued to honor it, even as its political importance waned. Closing thought. So Eridu endured not by strength but by memory. In every reed hut, every layer of mud brick, in every chant sung in Enki's name, the city whispered, "This is where it began." And so we ask, if a city never rules, never wars, and never expands, can it still become the most important city of all? In the hush of early dawn, when the marshes shimmer with mist and the sound of birds rises above the reeds, Eridu seems to stir from another time. Even at its height, it was a city of quiet devotion, not grandeur. Its temples did not glitter like those of Babylon, nor did its rulers ride out with banners. But in the low hum of prayer, in the regular burnishing of temple floors, and in the relayering of sacred mud bricks, Eridu perfected something more lasting: ritual continuity. We explore the institutional life of Eridu, its religious systems, temple economy, and the quiet engine of culture that churned over centuries even as other cities came and went. The temple economy of Eridu. Despite its remote location and modest size, Eridu sustained itself through a temple-based economy, a structure typical across Sumer, but especially vital here where arable land was limited. The temple served not just as a house of worship, but also as landowner, holding fields for barley, dates, and reeds when possible. Employer, hearing or supporting priests, craftsmen, herders, and laborers. Redistributor, offering rations and food in return for service or devotion. Record keeper, using early Proto-Cuneiform and later Sumerian script to track grain stores, offerings, and divine decrees. In times of drought or difficulty, the temple provided stability, offering food to dependents and maintaining the rhythm of religious life. Though less prolific than Uruk or Nippur, Eridu's surviving tablets point to a disciplined administration, where scribes recorded even the smallest transaction: 1 goat for festival, 3 jars of beer to Enki's gatekeeper, 5 laborers assigned to canal clearing. Sacred architecture as memory. What makes Eridu so archaeologically compelling is its architectural stratigraphy, the deliberate and precise rebuilding of Enki's temple, again and again, in almost the same layout. Each layer of temple construction preserved key features from the layer below: altars, hearths, niches. Used slightly better materials or more elaborate decorations. Demonstrated respect for the past, not innovation for its own sake. By doing this, the people of Eridu were not merely maintaining a building, they were replicating the cosmic order. The temple was not new, it was eternal, re-emerging each generation as it had always been. The use of clay cone mosaics, decorative cones pressed into the temple walls, reflected this ethos. Each cone was inscribed or colored, then fixed in orderly rows, creating a shimmering facade meant to reflect divine light. These cones have been found scattered across layers, suggesting that even as materials aged, their sacred presence remained. The role of priests and ritual specialists. The temple's religious functions were carried out by a structured priesthood. Chief priest N, possibly hereditary, often linked to high families or outside rulers seeking legitimacy. Cultic attendants, responsible for preparing offerings, lighting sacred fires, and cleaning ritual spaces. Musicians and chant leaders, played harps and flutes during hymns to Enki. Diviners, interpreted signs from dreams, livers, or water omens. Scribes recorded all rituals, donations, and visions. A significant number of votive statues, small, wide-eyed stone figures with hands clasped in prayer, have been found in Eridu and nearby cities. These likely represented individual worshippers, left as permanent supplicants before Enki. Their presence in temple layers suggests that personal devotion complemented the official rites. Theological significance: the Abzu and the cosmic deep. Central to Eridu's ritual identity was the concept of the Abzu, a term referring to the freshwater deep beneath the earth. In Sumerian cosmology, the Abzu was the source of life and the dwelling place of Enki. Unlike temples focused on the sky or celestial bodies, Eridu's theology was subterranean, aquatic, and introspective. The temple wasn't just built above water, it was designed to evoke water. Pools and basins for ritual washing represented the Abzu. Water channels were integrated into the temple courtyard. Priests may have performed rituals involving mud, fish, and reeds, all drawn from the marsh. Liturgical texts refer to Enki emerging from the water, bringing wisdom and life. This emphasis on water meant Eridu was not just a holy city, it was a ritual microcosm of the world. The temple, in a sense, was a controlled flood, a sacred version of nature's chaos turned to order. The flood myth in Eridu's symbolic death. In the Sumerian flood myth, known from the tablet Eridu Genesis, the gods decide to destroy humanity with a flood, but Enki, sympathetic, warns a man named Ziusudra, later Utnapishtim in Akkadian, Noah in Hebrew, to build a boat. Significantly, this version of the story is rooted in Eridu. The text emphasizes Enki's role as protector and Eridu as the setting of cosmic beginnings. The flood doesn't just wash away humanity, it threatens the cosmic order. The rebuilding after the flood mirrors the rebuilding of Enki's temple in historical layers. Thus, the mythology and archaeology echo each other. Both speak of destruction, rebirth, and the stubborn will to persist. Decline without collapse. Unlike cities that fell to war or political collapse, Eridu's decline was gradual and silent. The surrounding marshes began to recede. Salinization of the soil made agriculture increasingly difficult. Trade and political power shifted inland towards cities like The temple lost patrons as newer cult centers rose. Yet there is little evidence of violent destruction. The temples were abandoned respectfully. Bricks were reused elsewhere. Statues were buried or left in position. It was as though Eridu was not defeated, it was simply outlived, slipping back into the marshes from which it had risen. Closing thought. As we stand in the ruins of Eridu, where nothing remains but sun-dried bricks and the whisper of reeds, we find not grandeur but something else. A commitment to memory, to ritual, to slow, sacred repetition. And we ask, if a city never sought power, but only to remember, might it preserve something more essential than empire? At the edge of the southern desert, where the Euphrates no longer flows and the Gulf's waters have long receded, the mound of Eridu rests beneath the sun. Silent, forgotten by most, but once regarded as the cradle of civilization. We examine how Eridu's legacy endured through myth, cultural memory, ritual transmission, and eventually archaeological rediscovery. Though the city faded, its spiritual architecture remained woven into the DNA of Mesopotamian religion and culture. Through this endurance, Eridu speaks across millennia not in the booming voice of kings, but in the quiet cadence of sacred continuity. From marsh city to mythic archetype, as Eridu declined in population and political relevance by the early 2nd millennium BCE, its importance as a symbol only grew stronger. In Mesopotamian literature, Eridu is not forgotten, it is idealized. It becomes the first city from which all order descends, the seat of Enki, god of life-giving waters, wisdom and magic, the origin point of sacred rituals and temple architecture, a spiritual prototype, not just a city, but the city. Textual references to Eridu appear in hymns, myths, and kingly inscriptions across centuries. Even when physical offerings cease, the city lives on in the minds and liturgies of scribes and priests far beyond its crumbling foundations. The Eridu model, ritual and architecture passed on. One of Eridu's most lasting contributions is architectural and ceremonial. The repeated rebuilding of its temple on the same sacred ground served as a template for the Mesopotamian ziggurat, the stepped temple tower, that came to define Sumerian and Babylonian religious life. Later ziggurats, such as the towering structure at Ur or the legendary Etemenenki of Babylon, possibly the Tower of Babel, followed this precedent. Built atop older religious sites, elevated on platforms, evoking mountains or sacred height, oriented with cosmological symbolism, used for regular ritual maintenance and ascent by priests. Enki's original house, the Iabzu, House of the Deep, was replicated symbolically across Mesopotamia, even in cities that never saw Eridu's muddy canals. His cult spread, and with it, his model of divine wisdom and watery origins. Theological afterlives, Enki and Akkad and beyond. The god Enki also lived on beyond Eridu. As Mesopotamian empires expanded, Enki, called by Akkadians, remained a foundational deity in state cults, legal systems, and mythologies. In Akkadian and later Babylonian cosmology, became the god of magic and exorcism, called upon in healing rituals. He was invoked in oaths and treaties, especially to witness honesty and wisdom. His role in the flood myth continued to be adapted and retold. He became protector of knowledge, with scribes calling on him before writing. Even as Enlil or Marduk rose in political and cultic importance, Enki/E remained essential, often operating from the background, subtle, guiding, clever, much like his city. Echoes in later traditions. Some scholars trace faint echoes of Enki's mythos in later cultures. In Ugaritic and Canaanite myths, gods of wisdom and water hold similar roles. In biblical literature, the flood narrative of Noah shares striking parallels with Enki's warning to Ziusudra. The idea of a sacred, primordial city once perfect, now lost, finds expression in texts like the Garden of Eden and the City of Enoch. While we must be cautious not to overstate these connections, they suggest that Eridu's imagery cast a long shadow through its myths, its gods, and its concept of a sacred beginning that once was, and might be again. Abandonment and burial. By the mid-1st millennium BCE, Eridu was no longer a living city. The temple precincts were deserted. Sand and silt covered its walls. The Euphrates shifted course, leaving Eridu stranded far from active trade or water routes. And yet its ruins were left untouched by later builders. Unlike other cities which were looted for bricks and stone, Eridu seems to have been respected, even in death. It became a monumental mound, a visible sign of deep time, layered with sacred meaning, too important to desecrate. Rediscovery in the modern era. Eridu's silence lasted for more than 2,000 years. It wasn't until the 1850s that European surveyors began identifying tell mounds across Iraq. In 1946-49, Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar, along with Seton Lloyd, conducted formal excavations at Tel Abu Sharain, confirming it as ancient Eridu. What they uncovered was extraordinary. A stratified sequence of temples, from simple shrines to monumental structures. Cone mosaics, altars and ritual basins. Figurines and small offerings. Clay tablets with some of the earliest inscriptions. Evidence of continuous sacred construction for more than 2,000 years. Perhaps most importantly, they revealed that Eridu had no rivals in age. It was not only the first city in myth, it may well have been the first city in fact. A monument to stillness. What does Eridu teach us? Not how to conquer, not how to build empires, but how to remember, how to tie each generation's rituals to the ones before, how to center culture not in power or wealth but in rhythmic reverence. It reminds us that history is not always made in crescendos, but sometimes in whispers, passed from priest to scribe, from votive stone to mudbrick, from the deep water to the waiting shore. Final reflection. The reeds no longer grow thick around Eridu. The Abzu is dry. The songs of Enki are silent. But the foundations remain. And so we ask, what does it mean to be the first, and how does the first city still shape us, long after the last torch has gone out?